Good morning, good afternoon, evening, night, probably. Part 3, the sound of a wild snail eating. Juxtapositions. I like that word. Here's the little quote at the beginning of the chapter, or beginning of the part. I'm sure we'll have another one at the beginning of the chapter. Here's one from Oliver Goldsmith, from A History of the Earth and Animated Nature from 1774. The history of the snail has been more copiously considered than that of the elephant, and its anatomy is as well, if not better, known. However, not to give any object more room in the general picture of nature than it is entitled to, it will be sufficient to observe that the snail is surprisingly fitted for the life it is formed to lead. All right, then. And into Chapter 7, Thousands of Teeth. The mouth of the snail is armed with a very formidable instrument in the shape of a remarkable sword-like tongue, with an immense number of excessively sharp little teeth. The quantity of these teeth is incredible. That is from Dietetic and Hygienic Gazette of 1900. Should have practiced that one. I thought my snail's tendency to gently nod its head as it ate was just a personality trait, but there was more to it than that. Years later, I would read in more depth about the life of terrestrial snails. I requested through interlibrary loan the 12-volume compendium, The Mollusca, which covers the entire phylum of mollusks, soft-bodied creatures lacking a backbone, from the octopus with its human-like intelligence down to the tiny snail. The scientific name for a snail or slug, a mollusk with a single muscular foot, is gastropod. Derived from Latin and Greek, the word means stomach foot. The poet Billy Collins ends his wonderfully quirky poem, Evasive Maneuvers, with these lines. I said the word gastropod out loud, and having no idea what it meant, went upstairs and looked it up, then hid in the woods from my wife and our dog. If the term gastropod startled Collins, I wondered what surprises awaited me in the pages of The Mollusca. Arriving in random order, the dusty gray volumes were so heavy that I propped them up against other books and read them lying on my side. As I skimmed slowly along, reading a little bit each day, I found that every scientific field from biology and physiology to ecology and paleontology was packed with insights on gastropods. The abundance of detail was astonishing, ranging from either complex teeth patterns to the biochemistry of their slime making, and the intimate details of their species-specific love lives. Yet even with the Mollusca's many volumes, a certain perspective on snail life was missing. Then I discovered the 19th century naturalists, intrepid souls who thought of nothing of spending countless hours in the field observing their tiny subjects. I also came across poets and writers who had each, at some point in their life, become intrigued by the life of a snail. In the 4th century BC, in The History of Animals, Aristotle noted that snail teeth are sharp and small and delicate. My snail possessed around 2,640 teeth. So I'd add the word plentiful to Aristotle's description. The teeth point inward so as to give the snail a firm grasp on its food. With about 33 teeth per row and maybe 80 or so rows, they form a multi-toothed ribbon called a radula, which works much like a rasp. This explained my snail's nodding as it grated away at a mushroom. It also explained the odd squareness of the holes I had discovered in my envelopes and lists. As the front row of teeth gets worn down, a fresh new row is added at the back, and the radula slowly moves forward, being completely replaced over the course of 4 to 6 weeks. Radulae are adapted to a particular snail's diet and can be an identifying characteristic of a species. With only 32 adult teeth, which had to last the rest of my life, I found myself experiencing tooth envy toward my gastropod companion. It seemed far more sensible to belong to a species that had evolved natural tooth replacement than to belong to one that had developed the dental profession. Nonetheless, dental appointments were one of my favorite adventures, as I could count on being recumbent. I could see myself getting into the dental chair, opening my mouth for my dentist, and surprising him with a human-sized radula. Some snail species are predatory, and a few are even cannibalistic, and will bore a hole through another's snail shell or attack directly through an aperture. These snails have evolved fewer but longer teeth, which, rather sinisterly, they can fold out of the way to give more mouth room for ingesting their victims. This particular trait gave me the shudders. Even though my snail was not cannibalistic, I would not want to meet up with it, or any other snail that was human-sized, which brought to mind Patricia Highsmith's short story, The Quest for Blank Claveringi. Avery Clavering, a zoology professor, hears about the mythical man-eating snails of Kuwa, and hoping to prove their existence and gain fame by naming the species after himself, he sets off in pursuit. Arriving in Kuwa, he finds the giant 20-foot snail grazing on treetops. Then they notice him. He assumes that it will be easy to escape from two slow lumbering creatures like the what? Carnivora, perhaps Claveringi. But the professor gets a little too close to his live specimens, and so begins the most peculiar and certainly the slowest chase scene ever to occur in literature. With the giant snails in leisurely but relentless pursuit, Clavering becomes exhausted and seeks shelter between some boulders. One of the snails seals its slimy foot over his refuge, nearly smothering him. Eventually he escapes into the sea, but the giant snails follow, and the plot reaches its dreadful end. And that's the end of the chapter. Okay, let's see. Chapter 8, Telescopic Tentacles. Telescopic tentacles. And here we have a quote by Ernest Ingersoll from In a Snailery, written in 1881. The snail's tentacles are as expressive as a mule's ears, giving an appearance of listless enjoyment when they hang down, and an immense alertness if they are rigid, as happens when the snail is on a march. When my snail was active, its muscular head and foot were extended, but at the slightest hint of a disturbance, it quickly withdrew them into the shell's largest, outermost whorl. Its soft body, containing the vital organs, a lung, a heart, and a gastrointestinal system, was connected to its shell by an internal mantle, which also provided space for a water reservoir. It could store about 1/12 its weight in water, and thus, camel-like, survive stretches of dry weather. How about that? About half of my snail's respiration occurred through its skin, and the other half through a breathing pore, a little hole on the right side below its head, called a pneumostomy, like, pneumostomy. This pore allows air exchange by diffusion, opening infrequently, maybe 4 times a minute, more or less, depending on the snail's activity. As warm-blooded creatures, or homeotherms, we humans have to maintain a constant body temperature, but my cold-blooded poikilotherm snail's temperature matched that of its changing environment. Thus, it could get by on half the calories needed by a similarly sized mammal. My snail was equipped with 2 pairs of tentacles. The lower pair were 1/4 of an inch in length, while the upper pair were nearly 1/2 an inch long, with eyes at the tips. The snail could instantly retract its eyes through these hollow tentacles, which themselves retracted just as quickly into its head. This is a quote. The first striking peculiarity of the snail is that the animal has got its eyes on the points of its largest horns, exclaimed Oliver Goldsmith in 1774 in A History of the Earth and Animated Nature. And at the end of the 19th century, in The Dawn of Reason, James Wire explained more precisely that the snail carries its eyes in telescopic watchtowers. When my snail was foraging for food or grazing on a large mushroom, its tentacles quivered and twitched continuously. They stretched toward desirable smells, but were instantly retracted from anything the least bit offensive. The snail could move its tentacles individually in nearly any direction up to a 90-degree angle, sweeping them slowly back and forth and up and around, just as a boat underway in the dark swings its searchlights about to look for navigational marks. While we humans have 5 senses, relying most heavily on vision to find our way, a snail relies almost entirely on just 3 senses: smell, taste, and touch, with smell being the most critical. My smell, taste, and touch. With smell being the most critical. My snail could not hear anything at all. It lived in a world of silence. Its sight was highly limited, just a general awareness of dark and light to help with orientation. Bright light might warn of a hotter, drier, and more challenging environment. Dark suggested safer, cooler, more humid conditions. A sudden shadow might alert it to a predator. It was its tentacles, which hold smell and taste receptors, that gave my snail its look of intelligence and purpose. So critical are they to a snail's survival that, if injured, they can be regrown, just as a starfish can regrow an arm. In an article titled In the Realm of the Chemical, David H. Friedman explains, the land snail devotes about half its brain to taste and smell affairs. It divides the job neatly between its 2 pairs of tentacles. One upper pair is waved in the air to pick up smells, while the second lower pair is dipped tongue-style into promising substances as a final check before ingestion. Using the taste buds on its lower tentacles, my snail could distinguish between salty, bitter, and sweet flavors. The thousands of chemoreceptor cells along its upper tentacles were similar to those inside a human nose. Snails see the world through smell, the way many insects do, and they can detect aromas from a few airborne molecules. In its native habitat, my snail determined the source of a scent and the distance from it wafted based on speed and direction. There was no woodsy fragrance blowing through my room, and the snail, especially while it lived in the pot of violets, must have been surprised by the kaleidoscope of unfamiliar smells. The scent of humans, human food, tea, soap, paper, ink. Unlike the human nose, infamous for its secretions, The nose-like tentacles of a snail are the only mucus-free part of its body. And compared to the stationary side-by-side nostrils of a human, the snail's two independent tentacle noses give it a kind of stereoscopic sense of smell. I imagined a crowd of humans with smell receptors completely covering their arms, walking down the street of a town. As they passed coffee shops, bakeries, and restaurants, their arms would wave wildly toward the aromas. Perhaps restaurant critics so endowed could, with the flourish of an arm, report not just on their own entree, but also on those of other diners at nearby tables. Though the snail had a sophisticated method of scent tracking, I wondered how it experienced a life so devoid of sight and sound. In its native woods, my snail could not see the moss over which it glided, or even the plants it climbed. It could not see the trees, nor the stars overhead. It could not hear birdsong at daybreak, nor the midnight howls of coyotes. It could not even see or hear its own kin, let alone a predator. It simply smelled and tasted and touched its world. The closest I could come to understanding the snail's experience of its surroundings was in reading Helen Keller's portrayal of the richness of smell and touch from her own experience in The World I Lived In. And here's a quote. I am not sure whether touch or smell tells me the most about the world. Everywhere the river of touch is joined by the brooks of odor perception. Touch sensations are permanent and definite. Odors deviate and are fugitive, changing in their shades, degrees, and location. There is something else in odor which gives me a sense of distance. I should call it horizon, the line where odor and fancy meet at the farthest limit of scent. I wondered if my snail was aware of a scent horizon, and how far the odor of a mushroom could float through the air. A snail's navigation is complex, based on ever-changing odors, sources of darkness and light, a tactile sense of air movement, and through the touch receptors on its single body foot, a response to vibrations and types of terrain. This was how my snail mapped the wild woods from which it came, as well as the crate beneath the pot of violets and the terrarium. I combed through scientific gastropod literature. Eager to know more about my companion, I learned that snails are extremely sensitive to their ingestion of toxic substances, from pollution and to changes in environmental conditions such as temperature, moisture, wind, and vibration. I could relate to this, as my dysfunctional autonomic nervous system made me sensitive to these things as well. Since I was unable to tolerate most drugs, my doctor prescribed treatments at such minute doses that a pharmacist said he felt as if he were dispensing medication for a mouse. My body's temperature regulation no longer worked. One moment I was chilled, and the next too hot. This made life as a cold-blooded poikilotherm seem appealing. Before my illness, I could sleep through a full moon. Now, even with my room pitch black at night, sleep was elusive. The sound of the telephone sent a tsunami-like shockwave coursing through me, so I kept the ringer turned off. I could listen only to music that was slow and continuous. Anything with individually punctuated notes was too jarring. This restricted my entertainment to the calm of Gregorian chants at a barely audible level. I wondered if the snail could sense the vibrations through the air, and what Benedictine monks would think of singing to a gastropod. And that's the end of Chapter 8. Chapter 9, Marvelous Spirals. Oh, and here we have a quote from John Donne from, quote, to Sir Henry Wotton, end quote. John Donne's life was 1572 to to 1631. Wow, that's longer ago than I thought. And here's the quote. And seeing the snail with an E, and seeing the snail, which everywhere doth roam with an E, R-O-M-E, carrying his own with an E, house still is at home. Okay, sorry, I just had to say all that. All right, here it is again. Here's the quote. And seeing the snail, which everywhere doth roam, carrying his own house still is at home. There it is. Even when my snail was asleep, I loved to gaze at the beautiful spiral of its shell. It was a tiny, brilliant accomplishment of architecture, and because the radius of the spiral increases exponentially as it progresses, it fits the definition of a logarithmic or an equiangular spiral. Also known as the marvelous spiral, it accounts for the sound of the sea that one hears when an empty shell is lifted to the ear. Outside noise enters the curving chamber and echoes back and forth, jumbling into a continuous surf-like tone. The marvelous spiral. In 1905, G.A. Frank Knight delivered a lecture to the Perthshire Society of Natural Science, in which he noted that the whole subject of convolution in the mollusca is one of extreme interest and has excited the enquiries of eminent scientists. The animal with unerring certainty will mould for itself a habitation, which will be finished with an absolutely perfect devotion to geometrical curves, proportion, and principles. How infinitely varied this series of curves may be, and how wide is the scope granted. But the law of the spire of the logarithm must be strictly adhered to. In most languages, the word for snail refers to its spiral shape. In the Native American language, Wabanaki, the term is W-I-W-I, so wee-wee, limek, with a Q at the end, with no U. Wee-wee limek. And that means for spiraling water creature. Wee-wee limek. Giovanni Francesco Angelita, an Italian scholar, wrote an essay in 1607 titled On the Snail and That It Should Be the Example for Human Life. He praises the creature's thoughtful pace and good morals and credits it with inspiring everything spiral, from the invention of drill bits to Europe's most famous staircases. On the snail and that it should be the example for human life. I love that. As a snail grows, its mantle secretes material at the shell opening, thus lengthening and widening its house by increments to keep up with its expanding body size. A snail's shell is part and parcel of the animal itself, points out the 19th century naturalist Searles Wood, as quoted in British Conchology, and Edgar Allan Poe, in an odd leap from his usual macabre genre, comments in the preface to Conchologist's first book in 1839 that, quote, the relation of the animal and shell with their dependence upon each other is a radically important consideration in the examination of either. My snail's shell had 5.5 turns or whorls around its center starting point. I could see the past growth lines, and its final shell opening was elegantly rounded off with a wide, creamy lip. Was this curved lip a way to strengthen the shell edge? Perhaps it was a sort of built-in gutter system. I would learn soon enough that this detail proved irrevocably my snail's maturity. In Italo Calvino's book, Cosmicomics, in a story titled The Spiral, the the molluscan narrator expounds on the art of shell making and reflects on what it is like to be part shell. But it was the gastropod narrator in Elizabeth Bishop's poem Giant Snail that is so enchanted with its own shell that it made me want my own. And here's a quote. "Ah, but I know my shell is beautiful and high and glazed and shining. I know it well, although I have not seen it. Its curled white lip is of the finest enamel. Inside it is as smooth as silk, and I fill it to perfection." The whorls of a snail shell lean asymmetrically out from the center. My snail's shell was dextral, with a right side opening, as is most common. However, some snails are sinistral, with a left side opening. In his Perthshire Society lecture, G.A. Frank Knight takes us inside for an architectural tour. If we imagine the interior of the shell to be a spiral staircase, then, as we ascend a dextral mollusk, the axis of the stair would always be at our left hand, and similarly, if the mollusk be sinistral, the stair up into its interior would always curve round the axis on the right hand. Spiral direction has an impact on relationships. A snail must find a mate of its species with a matching shell. If a snail's shell gets injured, a repair can be made quickly. New shell material is secreted by the mantle, and where there was once a crack, a scar appears, looking much like a skin scar. Even a missing shell section can be replaced. Oliver Goldsmith described this in 1774. Sometimes these animals are crushed seemingly to pieces, and to all appearance utterly destroyed. Yet still they set themselves to work, and in a few days mend all their numerous breaches, to the re-establishment of the ruined habitation. But all the junctures are very easily seen, for they have a fresher color than the rest, and the whole shell in some measure resembles an old coat patched with new pieces. In an article titled Shellfish, Their Ways and Works, published in 1852, George Johnson praises the snail's shell as an edifice rivaling, nay, exceeding in complexity, yet order of details and perfection of elaborate finish, the finest palaces ever constructed by man! ! Johnson's elaborate finish probably referred to the colorful, shiny shells of the tropics. My woodland snail's shell, however, though beautifully and perfectly formed, was an earthy color with a modest matte finish. It was better described by the Mandarin Chinese words for humble abode, which are wo ju, or a Chinese characters, literally meaning snail's house. Reminding me of a rolled-up sleeping bag, the kind I had once strapped atop a backpack, my snail's shell was a brilliant solution to a life of wanderlust. And there was a further benefit. In the 3rd or 4th century B.C., the Athenian poet Philemon observed, "How ingenious an animal is a snail. When it falls in with a bad neighbor, it takes up its house and moves off." Unlike the sturdy external shell of my snail, my supporting structure was internal. But the bones that made up the skeleton deep within me were losing their density at a rapid rate, and there was little I or my doctors could do to halt the problem. My status as a vertebrate was literally dissolving. I would eventually become a spineless, soft-bodied creature, more like a gastropod than a mammal. And unless my armpits could secrete shell material, I would be more slug than snail-like. I observed my snail's spiral shell from the outside, but what was it like to live inside such a shape? Just a month before the onset of my illness, I had visited the Guggenheim Museum in New York. Halfway down the rotunda's spiraling interior, I stopped. It was dizzying to look up, as the floors curved around and above me, and equally so to look down to the ground level far below. Now I tried to imagine, were I as large in proportion to the Guggenheim as the snail to its shell, what would it be like to have my head sticking out the main entrance below, and my body wind all the way up the spiraling floor. End of chapter 9. We have another chapter, chapter 10, and this is the last chapter of our part. This one is called Chapter 10, Secret Recipes. And here we have another quote from Elizabeth Bishop from Giant Snail, written in 1969. Here it is. My wide wake shines. Now it is growing dark. I leave a lovely opalescent ribbon. I know this. Hundreds of millions of years ago, by chance, some marine snails evolved certain traits that allowed them to colonize land. To survive the challenges of a dry terrestrial habit, they had to keep their bodies moist. While my mammalian ancestors evolved dry skin to prevent dehydration, my snail's gastropod clan went in a different direction, perfecting and luxuriating in the sticky thickness of slime, or mucus. While Homo sapiens have internal mucus, and more of it than we realize, it's the extravagant nature of the gastropod to be completely coated externally. While slime can certainly be disgusting, it hadn't occurred to me that it might be interesting. So many times I had come in from gardening to wash up, dissolving the dirt instantly with water and soap, only to find that the patches of slime from inadvertent encounters with hidden slugs, the less aesthetic relatives of my elegant snail, remained impervious, sticking to my hands like glue. It took a pumice stone or even 400 grit sandpaper to get the stuff off. Slugs, despite what one might think, given their naked look, do not predate snails on the evolutionary tree, but were once snails that evolved over time to be shellless. Without a shell to tote around, they can change their shape more easily than a snail, thus squeezing into smaller crevices. The biologists C. David Rollo and William G. Wellington once commented with amusement on their gastropod subjects. A bag of cold water that cannot even move unless it leaks should not be able to survive outside a bog. And yet, thanks to their protective slime, terrestrial gastropods have thrived. Slime is the sticky essence of a gastropod's soul, the medium for everything in its life: locomotion, defense, healing, courting, mating, and egg protection. Nearly 1/3 of my snail's daily energy went into slime production. And rather than making a single batch of all-purpose slime, my snail had a species-specific recipe for each of these needs and 4 different parts of its body. It could adjust the ingredients just as a good cook would to meet a particular occasion. And in a catastrophic accident in which a snail is squashed, it can release a flood of life-saving medicinal mucus packed with antioxidants and regenerative properties. Skimming a chapter titled Molecular Biomechanics of Molluscan Mucus Secretions by the zoologist Mark Denny in The Mollusca, I came across a powerfully alliterative phrase that stuck in my head: the macromolecular architecture of molluscan mucus. The macromolecular architecture of molluscan mucus. The technical details were beyond me, but clearly the phrase had to do with how the stuff holds itself together, how a quantity of water is controlled by a bit of salt and a protein sugar. Denny points out admiringly that, Quote, if stirred with a rotating rod, mollusk mucus recoils when the stirring is stopped and has sufficient tensile strength to self-siphon out of a beaker. My snail secreted a special kind of slime for locomotion called pedal mucus, over which it traveled, while its ability to glide over a patch of moss appeared effortless. When it went up the glass side of the terrarium, I could see bands of minute ripples moving across the underside of its foot. These ripples momentarily turned the mucus from solid to liquid, disrupting friction and allowing the snail to advance at a speed of a few inches per minute. Its single-footed method of travel was far more ancient than my bipedal ambulation or that of my quadruped dog. Here's a quote. Upon this slime, as upon a kind of carpet, the snail proceeds, wrote Oliver Goldsmith. The zoologist T.H. Huxley, author of Practical Biology, commented in 1902 that the wave-like contractions of a snail's foot are so delicately adjusted that the creature can crawl with ease and comfort over a knife-edge surface. Slime travel has intrigued some innovative researchers in the Netherlands. Hoping to improve the comfort level of colonoscopies, they are designing a small robot that can travel snail-like through the mucus-coated intestines of humans. I wondered what other snail traits might inspire further biomimicry. Pedal mucus is an incredible adhesive. It explains my snail's ability to cross over soft mosses, proceed upside down along a leaf, or sleep oblivious to gravity, high on the side of the glass terrarium, or dangling from the tip of a fern frond. Before the snail's arrival at my bedside, the concept of ceiling art had absorbed my attention. I would concoct in my mind various methods for safely affixing horizontal images to the white surface above me. Perhaps slime glue was the solution. The sticking power of slime, in concert with a muscular foot, creates a creature of Olympic caliber, as documented by E. Sanford in The Zoologist, a monthly journal of natural history, in 1886. And here's a quote. Experiments to test the strength of snails. Perceiving a common snail crawling up the window blind one evening, it occurred to... Oh, this is a long quote. Okay, let me start this again. This is like a paragraph. Perceiving a common snail crawling up the window blind one evening, it occurred to me that I would try to discover what weight it could draw after it. Accordingly, I attached to its shell 4 reels of cotton, which happened to lie on the table. I then weighed the entire load and found it to be 2 ounces and a quarter, while the snail itself weighed only 1/4 of an ounce. Thus it was able to lift perpendicularly 9 times its own weight! Exclamation point. I then made an experiment with another and somewhat larger snail, which weighed about 1/3 of an ounce, the load being drawn in a horizontal position on the table. Reels of cotton to the number of 12 were fastened to it, with the addition of a pair of scissors, a screwdriver, a key, and a knife, weighing altogether 17 ounces, or 51 times the weight of the snail. The same snail, on being placed on the ceiling, was able to travel with 4 ounces suspended from its shell. I next tried it on a piece of common thread, suspended and hanging loose, with another snail of its own weight, which it carried up the thread with apparent ease. After this, I tried it on a single horsehair, strained in a horizontal position, which it had then enough to do to crawl over this narrow bridge without a load. That's the end of the quote. Where was the Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Animals? ? apparently was not paying close attention to snails. Perhaps the larger snail's refusal to carry a burden over the single horsehair was due at least in part to sheer exhaustion after participating in so many experiments. Snails will often refuse their own or another snail's trail in order to save on slime production. I'm sorry. That doesn't make sense. Snails will often reuse their own or another snail's trail in order to save on slime production. By detecting pheromones in a trail, they can determine whether it leads to foe, friend, or potential mate. Some terrestrial snails even gallop by picking up the front of their foot and leaping forward, leaving behind a dotted slime trail. This may save on slime, or possibly outwit a predator. If frightened, one snail species will lift itself up on its posterior and speed glide 18 inches per minute. The idea of being coated from head to toe with such a slippery, sticky substance was unsettling to me. I thought that my snail would feel an equal aversion to sunning itself on a hot sandy beach. Evolution has led to our contrasting skin anatomies and as a result to our opposite fears. And there we have the end. A single horsehair. Pretty amazing. All right. The end of part 3. Next time, part 4, the cultural life. See you next time.